They're dousing and trying to angle.
End still. It's very much an active fire, correct?
It's absolutely an active fire. I've been here for over 3/4 of an hour, and nothing seems to have calmed down, except for more fire brigades and water being doused on Notre Dame. No, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere fast.
We do see images of, lots of police and officials, obviously firefighters outside the church. Are they making sure that people stay far away? Are people cooperating?
People are very, very calm. We're used to events in the streets in Paris. We're used to bombings. We're used to terrorist attacks. And people's reactions, people are very calm and are just in shock, really, and standing by an ambulance try to pass through the crowd earlier, and everybody spread out immediately. So there is no sense of panic or sense of the fact that the fire is going to go further than the cathedral, the cathedral, the Notre Dame de Paris, which is very much isolated from the other buildings around it.
Right. No, it's shocking to the soul of a city to see such an iconic structure like the Cathedral of Notre Dame destroyed. I would imagine that the city, and maybe you can speak to this, will galvanize after this and do whatever it takes to rebuild it. Do you think that would be the case?
It was the case when there was the first terrorist attack at the Charlie Hebdo, the satirical newspaper. Everybody gathered and wore a T-shirt saying "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie. Mm-hmm. It was the same after attacks at the Bataclan, which killed over 100 people. It's a city that might be feisty and might go down to the streets and shout for its rights and seen it with the Yellow Jackets. There's been quite a bit of confrontation, but they very much come together when something so dramatic as this is happening.
And no doubt the Yellow Jackets are laying low this evening. Is that right, Tony?
Oh, nobody's going to be seen with the Yellow Jacket.
Yeah,
sure of that.
I am sure. Are you seeing great sadness on the streets, or mostly shock, like you said, and just sort of numbness?
Sullenness. Mm-hmm. The shock and sort of disbelief is a few tears. People remain very dignified. A few tears, and people are standing around. They're not going. The quays of the Seine are just stacked with people. There's over a few thousand people just from my vantage point at Quai d'Orléans. And police are patrolling, the firemen patrolling in a boat on the Seine, just to make sure that nobody falls in, I suppose. But
right.
Everybody's just standing here.
Oh my goodness! Well, Tony, thank you so much. We're gonna check in again with Candida Moss. She is on the phone with us. She's a theology professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Candida, how can we imagine that Holy Week there in Paris will be impacted by this?
Well, it's going to be a period of mourning. It's going to be a period of grief. And part of Holy Week always has that element. It always has an element of sadness in it. But that's going to be amplified this year because of what's happened at Notre Dame. And for so many of Paris's Catholics and visiting tourist pilgrims, they are going to have to find somewhere else to go, whether it's Sacré-Cœur or one of the many other less famous churches in Paris, because for many people, this was going to be their spiritual home this week, and that's no longer going to be possible.
And can we imagine that whoever is part of that congregation there at the Catedral de Notre Dame will be warmly welcome at any other church in Paris this week?
Yes, of course. I think it's going to give a heightened poignancy to Holy Week this year. Of course, people will be welcome at other churches, but we might even see sort of public religious displays, veneration at the site once the flames come down. There could be services held outdoors, for example, but so far we've seen sort of minimal response from the Catholic Church. I haven't actually seen a Vatican statement yet about this, and the Twitter feed of the Archbishop of Paris has been silent. Now, he doesn't tweet a lot, but you would expect more responses from within the Church itself.
Yes, I was just going to ask you about that, whether we'd heard anything from the Archbishop of Paris or I believe the catedral de Notre Dame has its own Twitter feed as well. I don't think I've seen anything there. It's easy to understand they are otherwise occupied at the moment, but still a lot of people hoping for news. You know, looking at these pictures, we're looking at some pictures earlier because you can tell that it's not as dark. You can see already how the famous rose window, even earlier in the evening there, has been affected by the smoke. Is anything likely to survive in terms of the beautiful stained glass?
It's likely that the stained glass is going to be damaged beyond repair. Of course, these things are documented and can be recreated. And I think people will ask questions after this. It was very difficult for people to raise funds for the renovations, which were really sort of the bare minimum that could be done. And part of the reason for that is just flagging church attendance in France. There just isn't the same life and energy to the Catholic Church in France that there once was. And so they were looking to international donors, including donors from the United States. And so I think people will be asking questions about the obligations of the church and the public to restoring the site, as well as the obligations of the country of France and its government to sort of maintain a site that has great religious significance, but also great cultural significance.
Exactly. Indeed, Candida. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to CBS News radio correspondent Bill Rakoff, who joins us on the phone. He's been a volunteer firefighter for the past 30 years. Bill, can you give us some insight into what these firefighters are up against and how a fire like this is particularly difficult to fight?
Well, I'll tell you, Tanya, church fires in general are really hard to fight, whether it's a smaller church with a big nave in it or if it's something to this level of a cathedral. And it almost seems as if, and, you know, I'm not there, but I'm just looking at it, as if the die was probably cast by the time firefighters arrived. I mean, that fire was high up on the roof. It presented a logistical challenge. The cathedral itself sits on an island in the middle of the Seine River. It may have been difficult to get apparatus into position, particularly the aerial pieces that need to put water on that fire up on top. You could try to go inside and do something with it, but with all of the flammable material inside a church and with those old timbers that build up and comprise the trusses of the roof, they go up like tinder, and you don't want to put your people in the road of anything that might collapse. So it was one of those situations where perhaps you get into the situation, you right off the roof, and hope you can save what's inside. You
know, we've been following this fire since the earliest images were coming across, and it appeared from what we could see that the fire started pretty high up. You know, it was either on the roof or on the spire. What does that tell you?
Well, I mean, that's where we first saw it. So we don't know exactly where the fire started. It's still possible it might have started inside the building and vented its way outside. Or, you know, it may have been the construction materials on the roof. It may have just been a coincidence. Right now, we don't know, and the investigators are going to look very, very closely at that once they get everything under control and are able to interview the people who were there and around the scene. But, yes, the fact that the fire started way up high makes it so hard. The other factor here was the wind. If you saw those earlier pictures, where that fire started, near that old beautiful spire, the wind was pushing toward the front of the cathedral, and it was a heavy wind. You could see that from the column of smoke that was just being pushed toward the front. That was also bad news for firefighters, because instead of burning toward the back, where they might have been able to contain it and try to keep the front of the building secure, and the wind pushed that fire along the roof line up to the iconic bell towers.
Now, in your experience as a firefighter, you know, when you're talking about wood this old, 300-year-old wood, could something, you know, as insignificant as a tossed cigarette be able to cause damage like this?
Oh, certainly. And whether it's somebody working on a roof or somebody outside of their house, casually throwing a cigarette into a potted plant next to vinyl siding, which is like liquid gasoline when it catches fire, from the smallest of sparks. And we've seen this with the wildfires out west. You can see such devastation. And that's why, firefighters are always preaching prevention and awareness about where you're doing things. So, again, we don't know if a smoking or the construction materials or maybe an electrical problem played a role. These are all things we're going to find out in the days and weeks to come. But, firefighters really had their hands full when they got here today. And certainly this is one that they'll go back and they'll talk about for the rest of their careers.
Yeah, I would imagine. And when you're looking at these pictures, I don't know if you're seeing the same live images that we are. What does it tell you? How far does this fire look from being put out?
So it looks like now, and from what we're being told by officials, is that the entire roof structure between where the spire stood and the bell towers has collapsed into the cathedral itself. And that's, one of the worst case scenarios because now you've got the fire and you've got the timbers and you've got the wreckage down into the nave of the building. And that's where all of the artifacts and the works of art are that people are so concerned about, and justifiably so. And firefighters are going to be mindful of that. If there was an opportunity to get in and try to rescue some of those, they would most certainly do it. But you're also talking about large statues. You're talking about huge religious artifacts that would have been impossible to remove. So even if they were able to get some of that stuff out, you look at the picture like this and see now the fire is burning deep in. It almost looks like it's a giant fire pit at this point. You don't see the visible flame. It's all down inside the building, burning the debris that's down in there. And I'm just afraid that the losses are just going to be tragic.
Oh, and it would be far too difficult or dangerous to send, firefighters into that situation, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I recall in my hometown in the city of Pittsburgh a few years ago, they had a large church with a bell tower catch on fire, and much the same way, the roof burned off. It went down into the floor and into the basement of the building. And as firefighters were operating around the outside, one thing you have to take into account now is the integrity of the structure of those stone walls. The stone's not going to build, but don't forget, you don't have the trusses holding them together anymore. They may have been weakened by the heat, some of the seams. And what happened in Pittsburgh was there was a giant collapse of the bell tower, and tragically, 2 firefighters were killed. So even though that fire's down in the pit right now, firefighters are going to keep their distance. They're going to keep a safe perimeter. They want to watch those bell towers carefully and also those large historic stone walls to make sure that they're not in a collapse zone.
So you're saying that those stone walls could very well, by the time all is said and done, they could very well collapse?
They could. It's a concern, but we've seen other pictures, and think about the school books you looked at of some of the great cathedrals and churches that burned during World War II and were left to be shells, not just in Britain but across Europe. That's likely what we're going to see here. Is you're going to see, and again, because they're stone, they retain heat, so it turns that into a large, in effect, a Dutch oven inside there, and we'll keep the heat and we'll keep the fire going. But there are potentials for areas of those walls to have been weakened, and I'm not talking about necessarily a complete collapse, but you have to watch out for pieces of those walls, and even if it's just a small piece with that stone, it could be deadly.
Bill Rakoff, CBS News radio correspondent and volunteer firefighter for the past 30 years. We thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you, Tanya.
We are going to turn now to CBS News correspondent Elaine Cobb. She is on the phone with us from Paris. Elaine, can you give us an update on the latest of what's happening there? Has President Macron said anything more recently?
Well, President Macron was down at the church with the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. He's already tweeted out that it was a terrible fire and a great loss to everyone. He cancelled an address to the nation that he had been due to give this evening in order to go to Notre Dame. Police officers there are saying that everything is collapsing, and a spokesman for the cathedral says the fire has taken hold of the entire structure and is burning solidly. I'm looking at pictures where it is still continuing to burn, and there is so much wood inside the church as well that it will keep the fire going, and of course because of the stone structure, there's still The towers are still intact, but the fire is still raging inside.
And so firefighters have not at this point given any estimate as to how long the fire may continue to rage.
No, they haven't. That's not something they would be able to predict at this stage, given the age of the building and given how the fire seems to have started, or at least first taken hold of the roof, which is, if you will, in the center of the building. So what is surviving at this stage are the towers in the front and columns and the area at the back of the cathedral. Of course, that entire area has now been evacuated. The island has been evacuated, and roads onto the Ile de la Cité have been closed. People are being kept very far back out of fear of any other very nearby buildings catching fire.
Right.
A lot of people still in the area watching the flames there.
So, Elaine, there are several people, obviously, who live on the Ile de la Cité. They will not be returning to their homes this evening. Is there any sense as to where these displaced people are headed?
An area has been opened up for them. A building has been put at their disposition. They will be housed temporarily while they have been kept away from their homes. The city is looking after them, and they have all been informed that they cannot go home tonight. There's also a hospital just beside the church. That, too, has been evacuated. Patients taken to other hospitals in the city, and people being told to just stay away from the entire area, also in an attempt to not hamper the work by firefighters who are still trying to get some control of the flames and to save artworks that are in the church, because, of course, Notre Dame Cathedral is home to many famous and priceless art treasures.
Absolutely. And Elaine, is there any more concern at this point that the fire could spread beyond the cathedral, or does it seem to be more or less contained within the cathedral now?
It seems to be contained, but it's too soon to say, because the fire is still raging, and if it takes control of the towers to the street side, away from the river on the north side, if it were to catch more there, it is not impossible that the fire could skip across the road. Now, the fire services are obviously doing everything they can to ensure that does not happen, but that is why they have evacuated everybody. Along that street to the side of the cathedral, there are lots of restaurants and cafes and fast food cafes who would all have highly inflammable, highly explosive cooking materials, oils and equipment. And so the firefighters would be very concerned about any sparks even flashing across the road there.
Absolutely. And Elaine, it is now, 9:30 in Paris. Can you give us a sense of what is the mood in the city right now as people are moving to their homes, presumably either going out to dinner or, children going to bed? What is the mood there in Paris?
Oh, people are in shock here. There's still a huge crowd on the neighboring Ile de la Cité and even farther up in Saint-Michel in the Latin Quarter, people who can get a view down. And people tweeting photos and their shock and their sadness at what has happened. Notre Dame is such an important part of the city. It's such a well-known monument, not just to Parisians or to the French, but around the world. And there are so many people everywhere just tweeting their disbelief, their shock. I've been receiving messages from friends around the world saying, I can't believe it. How can it be gone?
Right. It does seem absolutely unbelievable. It is really hard to fathom. Elaine, thank you so much. We will be checking in with you a little bit later. Right now, we're going to swing over to the BBC coverage coming live from Paris.
That is being reported by Reuters. A spokesman saying that this is an absolutely crucial 90 minutes ahead. Obviously, there's all huge level of damage there. The stone structure can crack. We know that the windows, of course, potentially damaged. We know that the rose window, of course, also damaged already. The spire has collapsed. Part of the roof has collapsed also. Well, we're joined by another eyewitness in Paris now, Annie Shipton, who lives in Paris and saw the early stages of the fire. Annie, what did you see? Where were you?
Well, I just finished work and I was coming round past Hotel de Ville and I saw the spire alight at the back of the church. Well, initially I thought it was another building and there were a lot of policemen around, fire engines, and it could have been anything up until the point I saw the smoke. And then I realised that it was actually Notre Dame, and then from then on, just a crowd gathered and everyone was just watching it burn. It was horrible, really, because no one could do anything. Everyone was so powerless. And the spire, which was initially visible, suddenly just got engulfed in flames, and then that took into the centre of the building. And then the spire collapsed, and the centre gradually caught light, and it just progressed towards the two towers at the front.
And where are you now? Are you still in the area?
I'm quite close, but I've actually walked back towards where I live.
And can you see, indeed, whether one of those two towers is indeed in flames?
I can't confirm that now, but it certainly looks like all of the fire was heading in that direction, and there's still crowds of people gathered there. I wouldn't be surprised if one of those two towers is alight now.
And did you see or hear anything when this started? Because reports that obviously there were workmen with this restoration going on, there was scaffolding in that area.